Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Module 9 of Foreign Language Teaching Methodology, the ELT Master's course taught at Southeast European University. The title of this module is Introduction to a Postmethod Approach. I apologize for what it says on the screen in front of me, Module 8. It actually is Module 9. I just forgot to change it. Now today we'll be talking about what happens after we move on from methods. To begin with, let's look back at Kamara Vadivel. This is the second reading for this module. We've had two readings so far. This is the second one. The first reading was on conceptualizing teaching acts. And if you remember K, because it's so difficult to pronounce his name, I'll just call him K, he refers to teachers as basically three different categories. And one is a passive technician, the second is a reflective practitioner, and the third is a transformative intellectual. Now, as you remember from previous discussion, we can be all three of these at the same time. There are, of course, some people, we've had some teachers who were completely passive technicians. You remember them. They stood in front of the classroom and they lectured, and students didn't get to ask too many questions, and there wasn't a lot of interaction otherwise. It wasn't very creative teaching, but it doesn't mean it wasn't entirely effective, because it covered a lot of material that way. Now, moving on from there, the technician becomes more reflective, and he becomes a practitioner. In this case, this is where I think most of us are now. We reflect on what we do. We consider ourselves professionals. We go about our work in a professional way, but we're aware that language learning is a complicated process, and it's not teaching something else that can be simply added one on top of another. So when you learn one concept, you can move on to the next one. And that all students are different, all situations are different, and we need to individualize our learning to suit our students, but also we need to think about how we approach things based on our own emotions, etc. So we need to be reflective. Now, there are cases where we can become transformative intellectuals as well. In other words, we can start taking the idea of the wider world into our teaching and incorporate that into our classroom, and consider the fact that we are not just language teachers, we are also role models, and we have an influence on our students, and that because of that, but also we have some responsibility as members of society. As I said, it's possible to be all three, but I think too much of the first would not be good. Now, I've just decided to put that up to review simply for the fact that the reading you'll have for this module from K is similar in a way. Instead of dividing teachers into three different roles, he's looking at methods themselves. And he says the methods are divided into three different types of method. You have the language-centered method, the learner-centered method, and learning-centered. First of all, the title is Understanding Postmethod Pedagogy. First of all, you have the language-centered method, in which case the learners focus on linguistic forms, and the development of language is intentional rather than incidental. In other words, you teach what needs to be taught, and the students learn what's being taught to them, and then you go on to the next thing. Learning is then a linear process, so there's not any recycling. There's no going back and forth and repeating something that's been learned before, or jumping ahead to something that the students are not prepared for. It's done in a step-by-step process, logically, from simple, basic, to more complicated. Now, you'll notice that the learner-centered method is almost the same as a language-centered method, except in this case, learners focus not only on the form of the language, on the linguistic forms, but also on the function, on how the language is used. So you don't just learn the structure, you learn how that structure should be used in real communication. Now, however, the other two items here are the same as language-centered. Again, the development of language is intentional rather than incidental, and that language learning is, again, a linear process. The only thing that's different is now we've added the idea that language has a function and not just a form. Now, in learning-centered methods, obviously the difference now focus not just on the language, not just on the learner, but also on the learning itself, so more on the process. Learners focus on meaningful interaction. Now, I think you all agree that we need language to communicate, and that when we learned our first languages, we didn't learn them necessarily to impress anyone. We learned them because we had things we wanted to communicate with someone. We need to ask for things, we need to get things, we need to express ourselves. That's meaningful interaction. There's a goal, and there's a reason why you interact. And so you need to achieve that goal through interaction. So learners should focus on meaningful interaction. And the development of language now is incidental rather than intentional. So this is obviously the opposite of what we've looked at in the other classifications of methods, other types of methods according to Kay. But the idea now is that learning will take place because the students need to know something. So in contact with the language, and trying to communicate and trying to interact meaningfully, they'll need certain items. And they'll learn these because they need to know them. And of course then language learning is non-linear. So it's not just a case where you can go from simple to difficult. You may have something simple, but you may need a more difficult, complicated construct in order to communicate what you want to communicate. So therefore you'll be jumping around from simple to more complicated. And it also makes it very difficult to follow a textbook. Now, you may think this is unrealistic. How could we have a method that's learning-centered? But I'll probably agree that all aspects, all different types of methods might be employed at different times in the same classroom. Anyway, his point here is just simply to look at methods and to classify them in 3 different ways. Now, in the article, he goes on to talk about the problems with methods and the problems with applying methods, and then he also proposes solutions on how to overcome this, some solution to the methods, or what Michael Long called the methods trap. And I'll speak about this more in a moment. But before we do, I thought we'd look a little more at what the limitations of methods are. One of the biggest problems of methods, I think, is that they're designed for a certain situation. And that situation is not the same as yours. Obviously, there are certain aspects where they're the same, but it can't be completely the same. If a method is designed for a small group, how do you apply it to a big group? If it's designed for students who are all at the same level, you have your lower intermediate class and all your students who are lower intermediate, fine, if you have that situation. Many people don't. If it's designed to teach one aspect of language, particularly spoken language, and not so much reading, writing, and other skills, then it may not be that useful. If it's designed for a cultural situation, a different culture, where there are different expectations in the culture, then that context is not your context either. So methods, because methods are designed to be universally applied, they tend to act as if they're separate from the culture. In other words, when they write the methods, they're not thinking so much about the culture, but obviously they are written within a culture and for a certain culture. So therefore the context is ideal, and when you apply them in a different place, there are some problems, because there are conflicts. There are conflicts in expectations from the students and the teachers as well. And these expectations can cause problems. Now, since the ideal context doesn't exist, methods are victims of trends and fashion. I think if you go back to the presentations we had on the history of language teaching, you'll see that's been true throughout history, that current beliefs, whether they be religious, political, or simply to do with what people think is right, what people think good education is, and think bad education is, on how schools should be set up and how teachers should behave. That these are basically just fashion. That they're what people think. But what happens inside the classroom is very much influenced by what's going on outside the classroom. And so these are the trends and the fashions. And methods, since the context is not realistic and is idealized, they can be influenced by these trends. Methods can never take into account the complexity of different teaching contexts. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. As a result, methods can potentially hinder more than help learners learn. This may be something you never thought about before, but when I mentioned a moment ago about expectations, that a teacher, for example, has expectations about how a teacher should teach, and then they're handed or they're instructed in a method which goes against those beliefs. Those beliefs perhaps come from their experience as students or come from their training. They can come from all these places, but they're there. And often the methods that are introduced in places, especially different parts of the world where more traditional teaching has predominated, newer methods can cause some conflict for the teachers. Now, some may successfully adopt them because they get their essence. Others may have more trouble. And in fact, I think the majority have trouble because they don't feel comfortable doing this. They don't feel comfortable teaching in this new way. And also, when they go to the classroom, the students look at them like they're not real teachers, because the students have some of the same expectations. So they see the teacher doing something which is not what a teacher should be doing. And you have to be a pretty good teacher to deal with student expectations. So this is one of the problems, and it can potentially hinder students from learning. Now, for the next few slides, I've chosen some quotations, and I'm going to go through and read them and comment on them briefly. But I hope that you'll think about them, and I hope they will somehow be meaningful to you. The first one I've chosen is also from Kamara Vadivel, and it is this: teachers find themselves in an unenviable position where they have to straddle two pedagogical worlds, a methods-based one that is imposed on them, and a methodological one that is improvised by them. I think the illustration I just gave you of the teacher in the far-off land who's been trained in a different method and told to use it in his or her teaching, but runs into conflicts with students, with themselves as well, because this is not something which is considered to be appropriate, culturally appropriate, to the educational culture there in that place, has a problem, because they're not able to implement the method the way it was put to them. So they have to improvise something else. Now, the example I gave you might be more extreme. Maybe it doesn't sound so familiar to you because the methods that you've been trained in or been exposed to make sense to you, and perhaps to your students as well. However, you can't escape the fact that when you go into the classroom and you try to teach in a certain way, it doesn't always work. So you end up improvising. And one of the ways that teachers improvise is they take what's called an eclectic approach. Now, eclectic means that they choose different aspects of different methods, different techniques from different methods that seem to work to accomplish what they want to accomplish, which I think most of us, and I used to think, was really the right way to teach, because you're taking the best from the best. You think, okay, someone's developed a good method. It doesn't all work in my classroom, but this aspect does. This is the way I want to teach something. When I teach beginners, I use TPR. It's very good. It works very well with beginners. Some aspects of the silent way work good with other learners. Some aspects of audio-lingual approach too, drilling, that also works. The problem with this is that it's not really an approach. It's a little too mixed up. You don't really have a coherent sense of what you're doing. Okay, and I think most of us would agree that if we go on just picking and choosing from different methods, we're always sort of working behind, because we don't know really where we're going. And often people will say, well, this is my method. I've chosen different parts and I've put it together into a method. Now, in a little bit, we'll look and see what the problems with taking that kind of approach, with developing your own method. And I'll just briefly mention now that one of the problems with doing that is that you suddenly developed a method, but that method can only be applied in certain contexts. Again, when you enter new contexts, you have to have a new method. So you're constantly redeveloping this eclectic method. And Kamara Vadivel and others believe that taking an eclectic approach is not principled. It doesn't have a coherence, and it's not something that you will work with well for very long. You can't develop it. And so we need something else that we can develop. The next quotation is by Pennycook. And Pennycook's, in this article, I can't remember the name of the article at the moment, but in this article he's looking at more of the political influences on language teaching. While it is clear that language teaching has undergone many transformations over the centuries, a thorough examination of the past suggests that these changes have represented different configurations of the same basic options, rather than some linear additive progress toward the present day, and that these changes are due principally to shifts in social, cultural, political, and philosophical climate. The influence of society. How much have things really changed, and how much have we just think they've changed? Because we're living in the present day, and the bad old days are done. It's a good question, good thing to think about. The next quote takes this idea a little bit in more the direction of you, the teacher. In order to arrive at appropriate methodologies, practitioners need to take time to investigate what happens in the classroom. Practitioners meaning you, the teacher. They need to incorporate into their approach to the classroom the capacity to look in depth at the wider social forces which influence behavior between teachers and students, and to take a broad view of how these are in turn influenced by social forces outside the classroom. I think it's a very good quote, and I hope you'll read it again carefully and try to think whether this is something that you can embrace, something that you believe, that whether it's relevant for you to consider your classroom in a wider social context. Since teachers' lives are different one from another, so their expertise will differ, with no model emerging as an obvious template. What is right is what works in a given context in terms of all the various cultures which operate there, including those represented by the teacher. There's a question. Why is something done or not done in a certain way? And does it work? Now, I believe that you all know what works and doesn't work in situations, what seems to work and what doesn't seem to work. But it's important to ask yourself, why is it done, or why is something not done? If you take, for example, drilling and certain forms of error correction, as in the autolingual method, which we've looked at previously, and the idea that you have these sort of call and response drills, you have individual drills, you have drills for the whole class, etc., and choral response. Now, most of us, I don't know about you, I do it some, but I don't see it happening much anymore, and I think that's because it's gone out of fashion. But in fact, it does work, and it's not a bad way to teach pronunciation. There are other ways, of course. It's not the only way, but it's not a bad way. It works. But why isn't it done? Well, the reason why it's not done, I think, probably is because it's not fashionable. It's considered to be old-fashioned. It's considered to be part of the way we used to teach, or the way maybe were taught, but it wasn't the right way to learn. So we don't do it anymore. I think having this kind of approach is a little bit unproductive. The question is, if something works, then look at it. Why does it work? Why doesn't it work? And then maybe if you think it works, why not use it? Why not incorporate it? And I think one of the things I like about the post-method era, the post-method approach, as I called it, is that it doesn't dismiss anything as much as it doesn't worry about whether it's part of one method or another method. It looks at what really needs to happen in the classroom, and if something works, then as long as it fits into what's supposed to happen in the classroom to facilitate learning, then why not? Now, the triangle, again, I put this one up. I have two screens of the triangle. The one showing different influences within the triangle. Students to material, material to teacher, teacher to students, back and forth, and other kinds of influences where it seems to be a bit confusing, but looking at all the different aspects of inside the classroom and different influences and interactions that take place there, very useful. But there's only one problem, is we're not looking at what happens, the influences and what's happening outside the classroom. That's difficult to illustrate. So instead, I've just taken away the lines, and I made the ovals containing the three elements of the classroom, the teacher, the student, the material, much bigger, and to try to emphasize their importance, and to ask you to think in isolation about each one of these things for a little while, and when you approach the study of methods. Now, teachers, as you know, have a lot of influences from outside, as do students, as does the material. We've talked about this quite a bit. So what are they bringing into the classroom, even before they interact with the other elements in the classroom? That's also part of the triangle. Now, Kamara Vadivel's solution is to develop a post-method pedagogy, to move beyond methods, to, instead of developing a new method, an alternative to method. Okay? Not just another method. To take a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down one. Instead of imposing a certain practice, a certain method, to look from the bottom, look from what functions, what works, and then work your way up to a more cohesive approach which can be applied. To promote teacher autonomy and apply a principled pragmatism. Now, teacher autonomy we've mentioned before, and we've also mentioned learner autonomy. And teacher autonomy and learner autonomy are very similar concepts. We want our learners to be autonomous because we want them to learn because they want to learn, because we know if they want to learn something, they have a better chance of learning it and remembering it. They'll be more motivated. It'll be more relevant to them. We also want the same for teachers. We want our teachers to be more autonomous. We want them to teach with an idea of what they're doing and why they're doing something, and to take control over their teaching. The same way we want students to take control over their learning, we want teachers to take control over the teaching. And it doesn't mean that, for example, students who are autonomous don't need teachers, or teachers that are autonomous don't need textbooks, don't need training, etc. They do. We all do. The point is that it makes us much more informed, and it makes us much more motivated to do what we do. And I think an autonomous student with an autonomous teacher will be a very nice match, because they will both be free to create the best possible learning opportunities. And the idea of principled pragmatism, again, I shouldn't spend too much time explaining these things because they are explained more in the reading, but simply just to mention that pragmatism is fine, but it can be eclectic. If something works, let's do it. But principled pragmatism is taking a more principled approach and then combining it with that idea of eclecticism, of pragmatism, of what functions, what doesn't function, but in putting it together in a way where you know why you're doing something, you know why you chose to do something, and you know where you're going with it. So the next time you encounter something new, you'll be able to apply those same principles, and suddenly the way you choose, your pragmatism, your reason for choosing something will be informed by the principles that you already have. This is an approach now, okay? Postmethod pedagogy, Kamara Vadivel, divides into three different parameters. That's the parameter of particularity, where is it within the approach? Is it within the what you want to achieve? Is it practical? Parameter of practicality. Is it something that can be done in the context? And is it possible? Okay, so practicality, I should say, is something which maybe it sounds a little bit similar, saying practical is what can be done. Practical is within the limitations of what you think should be done or what should be done in any given context, depending on that situation. And possibility is whether actually you can do it. Okay, maybe if you remember, we looked at methods according to, which is Richards and Rogers' distinction. We were talking about how to approach the study of methods. And we had the approach, right? We had the method was involved in approach to language or approach to teaching. And it had a design, which was a syllabus. And then it had the actual implementation of that syllabus, okay, and the techniques. So you had the approach, right, which is how you looked at language, how you looked at teaching. You had the design, which is informed by for that approach, okay. How the syllabus is designed is informed by what your view of language and your view of learning and teaching. And then you design the syllabus, and then from that syllabus you design the activities, the techniques that actually can implement that syllabus, which is influenced by that approach. And you might want to look at these three parameters in the same sort of way. Particularity being the approach, practicality being the design, and possibility being the technique. Perhaps it's not quite the same, but it's the same idea of a hierarchy from more general to more specific, from more principled outside approach to more concrete in the classroom at that moment. Now, further, Kamara Vadivel divides up his Postmethod's pedagogy into a framework, macro-strategic framework. And there's also micro-strategic, but this is the macro-strategic framework. These are the basic principles, okay, that teachers need to follow. And I've written up here, as a teacher, do you do these things in your classes? I think this is an important question to ask yourself. I'll read each of these now. I won't discuss them in much detail. When you do the reading, try to understand them, and then ask yourselves if you're teaching now, or you can even reflect when you were teaching, or you can reflect even on your teachers, and consider teaching whether these things are actually happening. First of all, maximizing maximizing learning opportunities. Minimizing perceptual mismatches. In other words, a situation where the teacher is thinking one thing and the student's thinking something else, or two different students are thinking two different things, and so that when they communicate, they're not coming from the same point. The context is different. It's a perceptual mismatch. Facilitate negotiated interaction. Promote learner autonomy. Foster language awareness. Activate intuitive heuristics. And heuristics is essentially sort of a common sense problem solving. Okay, so you want learners to approach things intuitively and apply their common sense to learning. Contextualize linguistic input. In other words, not just the form, but the form in the context in which the form is used. Integrate language skills. Ensure social relevance and raise cultural awareness. Okay. Now, as I said, I'd like you to look at these, and when you do the reading, consider them. And we'll be discussing further some of these ideas again in subsequent presentations. But for right now, this was just a brief introduction to the idea of post-methodology. And what I hope you can take from this is the idea that methods are something that are not necessarily things that will help us as much as things that constrain us. And that by freeing ourselves of methods is not wandering off, is not drifting aimlessly. There is a way to move forward without a method. And that's to look at teaching in particular, and to look at your situation in particular in the classroom. And as you observe teachers teaching, and as you observe yourself teaching, and look at teaching itself, try to focus on what works. Try to focus on the way that learning can be facilitated. And try to be aware of where you fit in, of where teaching is and what has influenced your teaching. And free yourself as much as you can from cultural constraints, and free your learners as well. Okay, thank you very much for listening. That's all for this module, this presentation, and we'll be back in touch again soon. Bye for now.